"Excuse me, what do you think you're doing here?" The words came sharp and cold, cutting through the soft hum of wedding preparations. Patricia Walters, known to most of the cul-de-sac as that neighbor, stood at the edge of the Brooks property, arms folded, her lips pressed so tightly they were nearly white. Before her stretched a vision of celebration: rows of white chairs dressed in ribbons, lanterns strung between oak trees, and a carpet of petals forming a makeshift aisle. Guests in neat suits and dresses milled about, laughter rising and falling in gentle waves. The bride adjusted her veil as bridesmaids helped smooth the fabric of her gown. At the center of it all, steady and unhurried, was Jimmy Brooks, the groom. His suit was sharp but unpretentious, his movements calm as he checked the placement of flowers and reassured nervous relatives. To Patricia, though, it wasn't beauty. It was intrusion. She stepped closer, her voice raised now so that half the street could hear. "This isn't some public park. You can't just take over the neighborhood like this. Do you even have a permit for all this noise and traffic?" The words lingered in the air like a siren. Guests stiffened. Heads turned. The bride's hand froze halfway to her bouquet. Jimmy lifted his gaze slowly, eyes meeting Patricia's with quiet steadiness. He didn't flare, didn't snap. Instead, he gestured toward the gate where a clear folder rested on a small table. Inside it sat neatly arranged papers: event permits from the city council, noise approval slips, and valet maps for parking. Everything signed, stamped, and official. But Patricia didn't even glance. Her scowl deepened, her conviction growing as if fueled by its own echo. To her, calm evidence was nothing against the power of suspicion. Whispers rippled through the wedding party. Guests exchanged worried looks, not about the legality. Jimmy had been meticulous in preparing every detail, but about the spectacle. The bride's mother tightened her grip on her clutch. The best man muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. A few children peered from behind chairs, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand it. Patricia thrived on that unease. With deliberate drama, she pulled her phone from her purse, fingers already dialing. Her voice sharpened into the practiced tone of authority. "Yes, this is Patricia Walters. I need police dispatched immediately. We have unwanted visitors disturbing the neighborhood. Large gathering, loud noise blocking traffic. It's out of control." Her words dripped with exaggeration, painting a picture far from reality. She described chaos where there was order, danger where there was joy. And on the other end of the line, the dispatcher typed, treating each phrase as fact. The bride blinked back tears of frustration. One of the groomsmen muttered about how unfair it was, but Jimmy only placed a hand gently on his arm, signaling for silence. His face remained composed, his posture unshaken. He knew this pattern too well. Someone's certainty dressed as concern, magnified into an official matter with a single call. Lanterns swayed lightly in the breeze. The string quartet shifted awkwardly, their bows resting against strings but unable to play. Conversations dimmed to murmurs, punctuated only by the distant sound, first faint, then distinct, of sirens rolling closer. Patricia's shoulders squared as if vindicated. She began pacing the curb like a sentinel, phone still in hand, narrating the scene for whoever might listen. "Yes, officers, hurry. They've taken over the entire street. No, I don't feel safe. It's completely inappropriate. They shouldn't even be here." Each sentence felt like another stone thrown into the garden, threatening to shatter what should have been a sacred day. Inside the Brooks property, tension spread like a slow fog. Guests who moments before had been smiling now checked their watches nervously. Some whispered whether the wedding would be delayed. Others quietly pulled out their own phones, unsure whether to record what was unfolding or pretend it wasn't happening. Jimmy breathed deeply, letting the air settle in his lungs before exhaling. He adjusted his cufflinks, not as a display but as a ritual of steadiness. Then he turned to his bride, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle, his voice barely above a whisper as he promised her with a look more than words, "We will not let this ruin us." But still the weight pressed in. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flickered against nearby fences, flashing like unwelcome fireworks. Guests fell silent as patrol cars slowed to a stop outside the gate. Patricia stepped forward eagerly, waving her arms as if welcoming an honored guest. To her this was triumph. To everyone else it was humiliation. The first officer stepped out, his eyes already scanning with suspicion. He hadn't seen joy, only heard Patricia's crafted version of disorder. The balance was tipped before a single word was exchanged. And yet, in the center of the garden, Jimmy stood motionless, calm. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply prepared himself. He knew storms could not be outrun, but they could be weathered. As the officers approached, the quartet lowered their instruments, the bride's veil fluttered in the breeze, and every guest held their breath. Patricia's voice carried high and clear, "They're officers. That's the man in charge. Stop this nonsense immediately." The perfect day had been hijacked. Joy was suspended in midair, waiting to fall. And at the heart of it, Jimmy Brooks chose silence over rage, dignity over noise. The storm had arrived, but he would decide how it ended. The sound of car doors slamming shut cracked the silence of the cul-de-sac. 2 patrol officers stepped out, their uniforms catching the glow of the streetlights. The sirens were off now, but their flashing lights painted the Brooks home in alternating red and blue. The colors bled across white chairs, glimmered on the bride's veil, and flickered against the petals on the ground. What should have been the palette of a perfect evening now looked like a crime scene. The guests stiffened. Some instinctively reached for their phones. A child clutched his mother's skirt, his wide eyes reflecting the lights. The string quartet, caught between duty and discomfort, set their instruments down. The bride's mother whispered a prayer under her breath. And through it all, Patricia Walters stood tall at the curb, chin lifted as if she had summoned justice itself. "This is the place," she announced loudly, her voice eager, carrying far enough for the crowd to hear. She gestured broadly toward the decorated yard. "The whole street is blocked. Loud music. No respect for the neighborhood. It's unsafe." The officers gave her a nod that seemed more than just courtesy. It carried weight, the kind reserved for complainants whose words were taken at face value. They stepped onto the property with slow, deliberate movements, their eyes sweeping across the scene. They didn't see a wedding first. They saw suspicion because that was the picture already painted for them. One officer approached the table at the gate where the permits sat neatly displayed. He picked up the clear folder, flipping through the pages with exaggerated care, his brows drawn tight as though hunting for hidden flaws. He held each document up to the porch light, tilting it as though ink might vanish under the right angle. The other officer scanned the gathering, his gaze landing on parked cars, the catering van, even the quartet who stood frozen by their instruments. His posture was wary, hand resting near his radio, as though at any moment this celebration might erupt into chaos. Guests whispered nervously among themselves. "They have all the permits, don't they?" one said. "This is ridiculous," another murmured. But no one raised their voice above a hush. The balance of power was clear. Patricia, emboldened, edged closer. She spoke in sharp bursts, feeding more suspicion into the air. "They're not from here. Look at the crowd. It's too big. There's no way they followed proper process." She gestured toward the bride's family, her voice dripping with certainty. "This doesn't fit the rules. I told you." Her words, though unproven, hung heavier than the printed papers. It was the weight of assumption, a force as old as prejudice, as strong as fear. The bride's father stepped forward, his face tight with anger barely contained. He tried to explain, pointing at the permits, naming the officials who had signed them. His voice was respectful but strained, like a man forced to defend what was already his. The officers listened, but their posture never softened. Their pens scratched notes on a pad, but their eyes held doubt. Meanwhile, Jimmy Brooks stood at the center of it all, still calm. His hands rested at his sides, his expression unreadable but steady. He allowed the officers to scrutinize the documents, to peer into every corner of the yard. He did not rush them. He did not beg them to move on. Instead, he waited, his silence louder than Patricia's accusations. But silence in moments like these could be misread. To Patricia, his quiet dignity was guilt. She leaned toward the officers, whispering with urgency but loud enough for guests to overhear, "See how he won't even speak? It's suspicious. Who knows what's really happening here?" The bride shifted closer to Jimmy, her bouquet trembling in her grip. He touched her hand gently, grounding her. His calmness was not for himself alone. It was for her, for every guest who looked at him now for guidance. Phones began to rise among the guests. First one, then another, then a small wave of glowing screens. People filmed quietly, some live streaming, others recording for proof. A cousin whispered, "They can't twist this if it's all on video." Another added, "This needs to be seen." The air grew thick with unease. The music had stopped, the laughter had gone, and what remained was the sound of papers rustling in the officers' hands, the occasional squawk of a radio, and Patricia's steady drip of commentary. "Too many cars. Too much noise. Not safe. Doesn't belong here." Each phrase was like a match struck against dry wood, waiting for a spark. Jimmy finally stepped forward, his movements deliberate, measured. He gestured to the permits once more, then offered his wallet with identification. His voice when he spoke was low but clear. He didn't defend with anger, he simply stated facts. His name. His address. His right to be here. His right to host this celebration. The officer examined his ID with the same suspicion he'd given the permits, turning it over twice, shining a flashlight on the hologram as though it might reveal something false. He looked up at Jimmy, eyes narrowing, still unconvinced. Patricia seized the pause, filling it with more of her certainty. Fake papers aren't hard to print these days. Anyone can make themselves look official. You should double-check everything. The officers exchanged a look, hesitation mixed with the authority of being the ones in control. The guests held their breath. The bride's face flushed with humiliation, her eyes glistening as she looked around at friends and family forced to watch her wedding turned into a spectacle. And still Jimmy stood steady. His presence didn't fight the storm, it anchored against it. In the distance, another set of headlights appeared, then another patrol car rolled slowly into the street. More neighbors had stepped out onto porches now, drawn by flashing lights and whispered rumors. Phones captured not just the wedding but the woman at the curb, the officers flipping papers, the atmosphere of suspicion hanging heavy over what should have been joy. The balance had not shifted yet. The power still sat with Patricia's words and the officers' pens. But the cameras were rolling now and the crowd was growing restless. The seeds of a larger story were being planted in real time. Jimmy glanced once toward the guests, then back to the officers. His calmness was not passive, it was strategy. He knew storms pass, but only if you endure them long enough to see the sky clear. As the second patrol car parked and more officers stepped out, the wedding party seemed to shrink into itself. Yet in the center of it all, Jimmy remained unshaken. Dignity was his shield, and patience was his weapon. The night was no longer just a wedding. It had become a test. The flashing patrol lights painted the street in restless colors. Red, blue, red again, reflecting off windshields, bouncing off the white chairs in the yard, and flickering across every uneasy face. The scene no longer belonged to the wedding party alone, it belonged to the entire neighborhood now. People emerged from their homes, drawn by the spectacle. Curtains twitched open. Doors creaked. First came the cautious observers, neighbors with arms folded, standing on their porches as if deciding whether to treat this as entertainment or evidence. Then came the ones with phones in hand, stepping onto sidewalks, recording clips that would later be captioned with hashtags and shared to digital feeds. For Patricia Walters, this was validation. She stood taller, pointing toward the Brooks home like a prosecutor laying out a case. Her words carried across the gathering, "Look at the cars lined up. Look at the crowd spilling onto the street. It's exactly what I told you." Her tone was smug, not concerned. To her, the growing audience was proof that she had been right all along. But to everyone else, it was discomfort made visible. Guests inside the yard shifted nervously, whispering to one another. A bridesmaid muttered that this was humiliating. A groomsman clenched his fists but said nothing, held back by Jimmy's calm presence at the center of the storm. Parents hushed their children, who stared wide-eyed at the flashing lights. The bride's grandmother, frail and trembling, sat heavily in her chair, whispering prayers under her breath. And Jimmy? He stood like a fixed point amid the swirling chaos. His suit caught the alternating glow of the lights, but his expression never changed. Calm, steady, patient. He watched, he listened, he let the storm move around him. Phones began to rise higher. Guests who had first recorded discreetly now held their devices boldly, pointing toward the officers, toward Patricia, toward the bride and groom standing under the arch of flowers. A cousin started a live stream, whispering into the camera, "They're harassing my family at their own wedding. Everything's legal but they don't believe us. Watch this." The viewer count ticked upward almost immediately. The murmurs spread through the crowd like ripples in water. A neighbor whispered that this was the third time Patricia had called the police on someone this year. Another muttered that she had once tried to stop children from selling lemonade on the sidewalk. Guests from out of town asked nervously if this was normal here. Locals shook their heads, embarrassed but not surprised. The officers continued their slow, suspicious routine, examining permits, checking IDs, asking pointed questions. Each pause stretched the air thinner, each delay pressed humiliation deeper into the celebration. The bride's father tried again to speak, his voice cracking under the weight of frustration. He listed the approvals, named the city officials, but his words landed against a wall of doubt. Patricia's commentary filled the silence. "Anyone can fake papers. Anyone can print a license. Do you want to risk it?" She turned to a cluster of neighbors, her voice rising with performance. This is about safety. This is about protecting what we've built here. But now for the first time some neighbors pushed back. A woman from 2 houses down muttered just loud enough to be heard, "It's a wedding, Patricia, not a riot." Another man standing with his phone raised said flatly, "You've gone too far this time." The tension began to split. What had been a one-sided attack started to fracture into 2 visible camps. Patricia and the echo of suspicion she had cast, and everyone else, guests, neighbors and strangers, beginning to question her story. Phones captured every angle. Clips spread quickly online, the bride clutching her bouquet with trembling hands, officers tilting papers under flashlight beams, Patricia gesturing wildly like a stage actress. The comments rolled in, "This is so wrong. Why are they harassing a wedding? She looks like every viral Karen I've ever seen." Some guests whispered encouragement to Jimmy. Others looked to him for direction. But he remained composed, neither resisting nor retreating. His calmness began to shift perception. Where Patricia's loudness had once filled the space, now it made her look desperate, exaggerated, unhinged. And where Jimmy's silence had been mistaken for guilt, it began to feel like strength. Children tugged at sleeves asking why the police were there. Parents struggled for answers. One mother whispered to her son, "Sometimes people make calls for the wrong reasons." The child asked if the wedding was illegal. The mother shook her head, eyes hard. "No, baby. It's not." Meanwhile, the bride's veil fluttered in the night breeze, its delicate fabric catching the glow of the flashing lights. She tried to hold her composure, but tears rimmed her eyes. Jimmy noticed, and with one steady movement, he squeezed her hand. No words, just the quiet reminder that he was with her, unshaken. The crowd swelled further. A jogger stopped, pulling earbuds out, filming on his phone. A dog walker paused on the corner, confused by the lights, then stayed to watch. The scene had drawn half the neighborhood now. Every new arrival tilted the balance slightly, every phone that recorded became another witness beyond Patricia's reach. The officers, aware of the audience growing behind them, grew more formal, their voices clipped and rehearsed. They said phrases like, "verifying information," and "ensuring compliance." But their body language betrayed unease. They weren't just investigating anymore, they were being watched. One guest whispered, "If this goes online it'll blow up." Another replied, "It already has." The cousin's live stream had crossed 1,000 viewers. Comments scrolled faster than he could read them, classic profiling. "These poor people deserve better." "Where is this happening? Drop the location, we'll boost it." Patricia tried to regain control, her voice rising over the murmurs. "You all don't understand," she insisted. "I've lived here for 30 years. I know who belongs. And this doesn't belong." The words hung heavy, ugly, undeniable. The crowd reacted visibly, gasps, frowns, the rustle of shifting feet. Phones zoomed in. That sentence was the crack in her armor, the one that exposed her not as a concerned neighbor but as something smaller, meaner. The officers glanced at each other. They hadn't expected the weight of community to turn against the caller. They hadn't expected to be filmed from every angle, their every gesture captured and judged. Jimmy stepped forward slightly, not with defiance but with quiet certainty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cameras caught his face in the glow of the flashing lights. Calm, steady, resolute. In that moment the storm began to turn. Not fully, not yet, but the tide was shifting. The wedding was no longer just a private event under siege. It had become a public moment, a story larger than itself. And everyone watching, guests, neighbors, strangers on live streams, was beginning to choose sides. The air still carried tension, but now it also carried something else, expectation. Something was about to break. The balance of power was tilting and the world was watching. The air in the cul-de-sac was tight as a wire. Sirens had stopped, but the lights still pulsed, washing everything in alternating shades of suspicion. Guests whispered, children fidgeted, phones hovered like lanterns, and the bride stood tense under the arch of flowers, bouquet trembling in her hands. Patricia, emboldened by the officer's attention, continued her litany. "Check everything. Don't let them fool you. People like this always bend the rules." Her voice rang out sharp and clear, filling the pauses that no one else wanted. The officers remained at the garden table, permits spread out like evidence in a trial. They asked clipped questions, their pens scratching against notepads. One officer held Jimmy's ID in his hand, studying it under the flashlight. The name was there, the address matched, the signature consistent. Yet doubt lingered in his eyes, as if he was searching for something invisible. Jimmy stood perfectly still, posture tall, face calm. He had said little, offered documents, waited. But now, as Patricia's voice grew louder and the officer's suspicion deeper, something in his demeanor shifted. He stepped closer to the table, his movements measured, deliberate, like a chess player sliding a piece into position. He pointed to one of the documents, a council permit with a QR code in the corner. "Scan it," he said simply. The officer hesitated, then pulled out a work phone. The code loaded instantly, taking him to a city portal that displayed the event approval in real time. The screen showed the council's stamp, the approval ID, and the exact date and time. Everything matched. There was no room for doubt. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A bridesmaid whispered, "It's official. It's real." A neighbor pulled out her own phone and scanned the code, nodding when the same screen appeared. Slowly, the weight of Patricia's claims began to falter. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He pulled a slim black card from his wallet and placed it on the table beside the permits. The card looked plain at first. No name embossed, no numbers visible, just a sleek design with a faint metallic logo in the corner. The officer picked it up, puzzled. He turned it over once, then twice, then frowned. Recognition flickered across his face. He had seen that logo before, not in public spaces but in official training slides in restricted databases. It belonged to a corporate access program, one reserved for individuals with clearance far above ordinary citizens. He looked at Jimmy, then back at the card, then quietly set it down again without a word. Phones caught the gesture. Guests noticed the officer's change in posture. Patricia's voice grew louder, trying to drown out what she didn't understand. Cards don't mean anything. Anyone can flash a fake badge. But her certainty no longer landed the way it had before. Jimmy reached into his suit pocket again, this time producing a sleek phone, different from the one he'd used earlier. He unlocked it with a quick scan and opened an app, holding it up for the officers to see. The screen displayed a live dashboard, noise levels measured by decibel meters around the neighborhood, parking flow statistics showing cars neatly arranged along the street, even a live permit validation feed directly from the city's servers. "This," Jimmy said calmly, "is the compliance system your office uses. Real-time. Verified." The officers leaned closer, their skepticism thinning. The dashboard wasn't something a random person could fake. It was the kind of access given only to contractors, city partners, or people with major institutional ties. The crowd buzzed. A cousin whispered, "How does he even have that?" A neighbor muttered, That's not normal access." Phones zoomed in, live streams carried every detail. The viewers multiplied. Jimmy didn't posture, didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the phone back in his pocket, stacked the papers neatly, and looked at the officers with quiet patience. His expression said what he didn't need to put into words. "I belong here. This is mine. And you are running out of excuses. Patricia, sensing the ground slipping beneath her, grew frantic. She waved her arms, stepping closer to the gate. "Don't be fooled. This is all staged. He's tricking you. People like this know how to get around the rules." Her words landed hollow now, sharp but empty. Neighbors began to murmur against her. "It's all legal, Patricia. You're making a fool of yourself. This is a wedding, not a scam." Her face reddened, her certainty cracking. Meanwhile, Jimmy shifted his focus, not to the officers, not to Patricia, but to the cameras. He knew eyes were watching far beyond the cul-de-sac now. Live streams were climbing in viewership, clips were already circulating, and narratives were being written in real time. Every movement he made was deliberate, not just for the people in front of him but for the wider audience forming online. And so, he chose his next move carefully. He opened his wallet once more and placed his driver's license beside the black card. The officer glanced again, reading the full name, Jameson Jimmy Brooks. The name wasn't common. It rang faint bells, half-remembered headlines, snippets of tech news articles. The officer's brows drew together. He looked as though he wanted to ask something, but the weight of the crowd kept him silent. "Guess noticed too." A cousin nudged another. "Brooks? Wait. Like Brooks Technologies." Another whispered back, "No, can't be. That's too crazy." But the seed was planted. The murmur spread, small and electric. Jimmy didn't confirm. Not yet. He simply stood steady, letting the idea hover in the air like smoke before a fire. The officer's demeanor softened, just slightly. Their pens stopped scratching. Their posture straightened. They weren't apologetic, not yet, but they were no longer treating Jimmy as an intruder. They were beginning to suspect they had misjudged him. And Patricia knew it. She snapped at the nearest officer, demanding to know why nothing was being done, why the wedding wasn't being shut down. But this time, instead of nodding along, the officer simply said, "We're reviewing the documents." It was a small shift, but one everyone felt. The crowd leaned forward, phones held high. Neighbors whispered. The bride squeezed Jimmy's hand, her fears slowly giving way to cautious hope. And Jimmy, calm as ever, stood at the center, his dignity intact, his quiet power beginning to surface. The storm had not broken yet, but the winds had changed. Patricia's voice no longer carried authority. The officers' pens no longer carried certainty. And Jimmy Brooks, with nothing more than documents, a black card, and a quiet presence, had begun to tilt the entire scene. The balance of power was no longer hers. It was slipping inch by inch into his hands. The night had reached a still point, a breathless pause where everyone waited for the next move. Permits had been verified, QR codes had scanned, the officer's suspicion had begun to falter, but it was not gone. Patricia still prowled at the curb, her voice shrill with determination. The crowd, now swollen with neighbors, guests, and live-stream viewers, leaned in like an audience before the final act of a play. The weight of humiliation lingered in the air. The bride's veil trembled in the breeze. The guests held their phones higher, capturing every detail, every expression. The officers stood stiffly, documents in hand, still unsure how to conclude what had begun as a disturbance call. The balance was teetering. And then Jimmy Brooks moved. He reached into his jacket with calm precision, withdrawing a small leather card holder. The movement was deliberate but unhurried, the kind of gesture made by someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to remind others of. He placed a single business card on the table beside the permits. The officer nearest picked it up, expecting a contractor's card or some neighborhood association detail. Instead, his eyes landed on embossed text that seemed almost out of place in the suburban cul-de-sac glow of fairy lights and police flashers. Jameson Brooks, Chief Executive Officer. Brooks Technologies ***. The officer blinked, read it again and then a third time. The name matched the driver's license he had studied moments earlier. The logo was one he recognized from headlines, even from the phone in his pocket. Brooks Technologies wasn't a small firm. It was the firm, one of the biggest tech companies in the country, a corporation whose software quietly powered half the devices in the crowd, including the live streams broadcasting this very moment. The officer's posture shifted. His suspicion drained into confusion, then into something closer to apology. His partner leaned over his shoulder, scanning the card, then froze as realization dawned. Whispers began to ripple outward, carried first by the nearest guests, then spreading like fire through dry grass. Brooks? Like that Brooks? No way, he's the CEO? I read about him last week. Didn't Forbes just do a cover story? Phones zoomed in on the card, catching the embossed letters gleaming in the red and blue light. Livestream chats exploded in real time. Wait, isn't that a billionaire? Asterisk, that's Jimmy Brooks. Oh my god, he's a tech giant. Asterisk. Karen just called the cops on the CEO of Brooks Tech at his own wedding. This is insane. The crowd's energy shifted instantly. Where tension had once silenced them, now there was a growing roar of disbelief, awe, and indignation. Guests gasped aloud. A bridesmaid put a hand over her mouth. The bride's father let out a laugh, half relief, half fury at the absurdity of it all. Patricia, though, faltered. Her words stuttered into silence as she realized the ground beneath her had vanished. Her certainty, her smugness, her role as protector of the neighborhood, all of it cracked the moment the name landed in the open air. She opened her mouth to protest but found nothing to say. Jimmy remained composed. He didn't gloat, didn't point fingers. He simply folded his hands in front of him and let the silence work. His quiet dignity now carried the weight of power, and the crowd felt it. The officers shifted awkwardly, no longer interrogators but men scrambling to align themselves with the reality of who stood before them. One officer cleared his throat, voice softer now. Mr. Brooks, we appreciate your cooperation. Clearly everything here is in order. The words, caught on dozens of phones, landed like a confession. The same man who had been treated with suspicion moments earlier was now addressed with reverence. Not because of his permits, not because of his ID, but because of the weight of his title. The irony did not go unnoticed. Jimmy lifted his gaze, steady and calm. He spoke finally, his voice low but resonant enough for the crowd to hear. This was never about paperwork. This was about assumption. The words carried more than sound, they carried truth. The guests nodded, murmured agreement, their phones catching every syllable. The livestream chats exploded again. He's right. They doubted him until they saw his title. Asterisk, the dignity he held through all this? Respect. Asterisk. This is what quiet power looks like. Patricia's face flushed deep red. She stammered something about not knowing, about just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's rising energy. Neighbors who had stayed silent earlier now spoke openly, some scolding her, others shaking their heads in embarrassment. This is a disgrace. You've embarrassed the entire block. Calling the cops on your own neighbor at his wedding? The narrative had flipped. Patricia was no longer the concerned resident. She was the antagonist, the symbol of baseless suspicion and prejudice. And Jimmy Brooks, the man she had accused of not belonging, was revealed as someone who belonged more deeply than anyone could have imagined. The homeowner, the groom, and one of the most influential figures in the city. The officers, realizing the scene was collapsing against them, began to pack their notepads, offering stilted apologies. One muttered something about miscommunication. Another said, "We'll note this as resolved." Their voices carried none of the authority they had wielded minutes earlier. Phones captured their discomfort, live-stream viewers jeering in the comments. Now they're backpedaling. Funny how fast respect comes when money and power show up. This is going viral. The bride, finally able to breathe, leaned into Jimmy, her eyes wet with relief. The guests, sensing the shift, began clapping. First a few, then more, until the entire backyard thundered with applause. It wasn't just for Jimmy's status. It was for his composure, his dignity, the way he had refused to let anger steal the moment. Jimmy raised a hand, quieting the noise just enough. "Tonight was supposed to be about love," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And it still is. But let this moment remind us, respect should not depend on titles." The words landed heavy. They would be replayed in clips, quoted in captions, written into headlines by morning. Patricia shrank back toward the curb, her phone clutched limply in her hand. She looked smaller now, her posture sagging as neighbors turned away from her. The power she thought she had wielded with a single phone call had been stripped bare, exposed as nothing more than noise. The wedding resumed, not quietly but triumphantly. Music rose again, brighter than before. Guests cheered, some crying, some laughing in disbelief. The bride's smile returned, radiant under the lanterns. And beyond the cul-de-sac, the story had already left the block. Live streams were trending. Clips were being shared on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Karen called the cops, hashtag wedding justice, hashtag Brooks Texio. Within hours, millions would know what happened in that quiet neighborhood. For Patricia, it was humiliation. For the officers, it was a lesson. For the wedding guests, it was vindication. And for Jimmy Brooks, it was not about revenge but about truth. The storm had broken, and he had stood through it with dignity intact. The applause in the Brooks backyard had barely faded before the weight of consequences began to settle. The wedding guests, neighbors, and officers all stood in the glow of string lights and flashing patrol cars, stunned by what they had just witnessed. A billionaire tech CEO had been forced to reveal his identity just to defend his own wedding, and now nothing in the cul-de-sac felt the same. Phones were still recording. Clips were already being uploaded to platforms faster than anyone could count. Hashtags multiplying, comments pouring in. The live streams carried the moment from one backyard to a global audience. The suspicion, the reveal, the stunned silence, and the shift in power. By the time the music resumed, the story was already a headline in waiting. The first wave of consequences hit Patricia. Neighbors who had once tolerated her complaints now turned openly against her. Whispers grew louder. She crossed the line. "This isn't just nosiness, it's harassment. She embarrassed all of us." The same people who had quietly looked away during her past outbursts now spoke with anger, emboldened by the truth that had been exposed in front of everyone. Patricia's face was drained of color, her earlier smugness replaced by a fragile, panicked silence. She clutched her phone but no longer dared to speak. Every gesture she made was caught on camera, every twitch of her lip broadcast to thousands online. Her certainty had collapsed, and what remained was only humiliation. She had called the police on her own neighbor at his wedding, and not just any neighbor but the man who built one of the most powerful companies in the country. The officers faced their own reckoning. They had walked into the scene with suspicion thick in their posture, with pens ready to write up violations that didn't exist. They had treated a groom like an intruder, questioned his documents as if they were counterfeit, and ignored the dignity of the entire gathering. Now, standing face to face with the CEO whose technology they likely used every day, they looked small, uncomfortable, caught in a spotlight brighter than their patrol cars. The senior officer cleared his throat, offering a stiff apology that sounded rehearsed. "Mr. Brooks, our intent was to ensure public safety. "We regret any inconvenience caused." The words were thin, fragile, and the crowd knew it. Phones captured the statement, and comments online exploded with sarcasm. Regret any inconvenience? He was humiliated at his own wedding. Funny how quick the apology comes once they know who he is. They weren't protecting safety, they were protecting bias. The department would not escape unscathed. Within hours, the footage would reach city officials. Calls for review of the officer's conduct, demands for accountability, and petitions for anti-bias training would follow. What began as one phone call from Patricia would now ripple into police boardrooms and city council meetings. The neighborhood itself felt the shockwaves. The HOA president, who had once leaned heavily on Patricia's complaints, stood stiffly at the edge of the crowd. He had encouraged her to keep standards high, to monitor disturbances. Now those same standards looked like tools of exclusion, sharpened into weapons against one of their own. His reputation, once untouchable in the HOA's small circle, cracked under the weight of the cameras. Inside the wedding, emotions were mixed. Relief that the ordeal was over. Anger that it had happened at all. Pride that Jimmy had remained calm. Guests embraced, some crying, some laughing nervously. The bride's father muttered that he would never forgive Patricia for staining this day. The bride's mother whispered gratitude that dignity had carried them through. And Jimmy? He stood quietly, still steady, still calm, though now his calmness carried new weight. He had been forced to pull back the curtain to reveal his title, his power, his influence. But he had done so without rage, without gloating. The crowd's respect wasn't just for his status. It was for the way he had carried it, with patience, composure, and dignity. Yet he knew the story wasn't over. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. The cameras had ensured that. Clips were already trending on Twitter. Karen calls cops on wedding, groom revealed as tech CO. News outlets were reaching out for statements. Analysts were speculating about Brooks Technology's response. The narrative had grown legs of its own, and it was sprinting into boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country. Patricia's downfall was swift. Within days, the HOA announced an emergency meeting to review her role in the community. Neighbors submitted formal complaints, citing years of harassment. Petition drives circulated online to remove her from any position of authority in the association. She became a symbol, not of order but of prejudice cloaked in neighborhood rules. The police department, facing public outrage, launched an internal review. Training officers admitted the incident had already gone viral among the ranks, used as an example of what not to do. The chief issued a public statement, promising to strengthen cultural sensitivity and bias awareness. It was damage control, but it was also an admission. The system had failed and it had been caught on camera. For Brooks Technologies, the story became an opportunity. Jimmy's communications team, alerted within hours of the incident, prepared a statement. It was short, dignified, and powerful. Respect should not depend on titles. We must build systems, both technological and social, that treat every person with dignity regardless of who they are. The message trended globally, quoted in newspapers, reposted on company forums, and applauded by advocacy groups. In corporate circles, the event became a case study. Business schools dissected it. Leadership blogs wrote about it. The image of Jimmy standing calm under flashing lights, holding permits and a black card, became iconic. A modern story of quiet power confronting loud prejudice. The personal consequences were profound too. Neighbors who had once doubted Jimmy now spoke of him with reverence. Parents told their children about the night they saw dignity win. Guests who had live-streamed the ordeal found their videos replayed on news broadcasts, their shaky phone footage now historic in its own small way. And Patricia? She couldn't walk the street without whispers. Her name became shorthand for pettiness, for prejudice. Strangers online dubbed her Wedding Karen. Her attempts at justification only deepened the ridicule. She had tried to protect the standards of the neighborhood, and in doing so, she had destroyed her own. Jimmy didn't seek revenge. He didn't demand punishments. He didn't need to. Consequences had unfolded naturally, driven by the truth captured in countless videos. His calm had exposed the imbalance more clearly than anger ever could. And by choosing dignity over rage, he had turned humiliation into reform. As the wedding continued, music swelled again, brighter than before. Guests danced under the lanterns. Laughter returned, not to erase what had happened, but to reclaim joy from it. The bride smiled through tears, her veil catching the light like a banner of resilience. But the night was no longer just a celebration of love. It was a turning point, A story that would ripple far beyond the cul-de-sac, reshaping conversations about bias, authority, and quiet power. Jimmy Brooks had not just defended his wedding. He had set in motion a reckoning. And though the music played and the petals scattered, everyone present knew, the true legacy of that night would be written not in the vows, but in the consequences that followed. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that night did not fade. What began as a neighborhood dispute had grown into a story that crossed local news, national headlines, and global feeds. Videos of Patricia calling the police, the officers scrutinizing the permits, and Jimmy Brooks calmly revealing his CEO card had been watched millions of times. Clips were replayed in boardrooms, on talk shows, and in classrooms. The night had become more than gossip. It had become a symbol. The first ripples of reform began at the neighborhood level. The Homeowners Association, once Patricia's stage for constant complaints, faced pressure from every direction. Neighbors demanded accountability, citing years of her harassment disguised as protecting standards. Attendance at HOA meetings doubled, then tripled, with residents who had previously stayed silent now standing to speak. For the first time, stories were shared. Families who had been accused of not fitting in, children who had been scolded for playing outside too loudly, guests who had been treated as intruders. Patricia's call to the police had been the final straw, the spark that revealed a pattern. The HOA board responded quickly. They stripped Patricia of her committee roles. They drafted new policies requiring documented evidence for any complaints, with penalties for repeated false or prejudiced claims. A review panel of rotating neighbors, not just a fixed few, was created to ensure fairness. And for the first time, the community newsletter carried not notes about lawn heights and paint colors but reminders of inclusivity and respect. The language of standards had been replaced with the language of belonging. At the city level, the police department felt the weight of scrutiny. The footage of officers treating a groom as a suspect at his own wedding had been damning. Public pressure mounted. Advocacy groups demanded change. City officials convened emergency meetings, aware that inaction would only fuel outrage. Within a month, the department announced a new initiative, bias triage for 911 calls. Dispatchers were now trained to flag language like, "they don't belong," or "unwanted visitors." Such calls would be reviewed by a supervisor before being escalated. The goal was simple but profound, to prevent assumptions from becoming armed responses. Officers received new training modules built around Jimmy's case. Reenactments of the wedding incident became part of academy instruction, teaching recruits not just the dangers of bias, but the quiet power of dignity. The phrase "don't assume, verify" became a mantra in roll calls. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In corporate circles, Brooks Technologies took the incident further. Jimmy's communications team crafted a measured response that avoided spectacle but spoke to principle. Their statement was brief. Respect should not depend on titles. Our mission has always been to build systems that serve everyone equally. We will continue that mission in technology and in community. But behind the scenes, Jimmy pushed deeper. Brooks Technologies launched a civic tech fund dedicated to transparency tools. Apps that allowed communities to track permits, verify event approvals, and resolve disputes without escalation. A pilot program in the very same city gave residents access to live dashboards showing noise levels, traffic counts, and permits. Instead of suspicion, there was information. Instead of conflict, there was clarity. The impact was immediate. Families hosting block parties or cultural celebrations no longer feared a neighbor's call. Everything was documented, visible, indisputable. Complaints had to face facts before they could become accusations. Nationally, the story entered a broader conversation. Media outlets debated what it revealed: how suspicion too often fell on the innocent, how dignity was mistaken for guilt, how respect shifted only when titles or wealth were revealed. Commentators pointed out the irony that Jimmy Brooks, one of the most powerful men in the city, had been forced to reveal his wealth to secure respect that should have been his as a human being. The viral clips were dissected not just for the drama but for the lessons. Leadership blogs wrote about Jimmy's calmness under fire. Social justice groups cited the story as proof of systemic flaws. Business schools used it as a case study on quiet power versus loud prejudice. For Patricia, life changed irrevocably. Her name, once wielded like a badge of authority in the neighborhood, became synonymous with humiliation. Online, she was branded Wedding Karen, a symbol of petty cruelty and baseless suspicion. She withdrew from community life, her influence gone. Neighbors avoided her gaze. Former allies turned their backs. Her attempt to enforce order had left her isolated. But Jimmy didn't seek revenge. When asked by reporters if he wanted Patricia punished, his response was simple. Asterisk, this isn't about her alone. It's about what allowed her to believe she was right. If the system doesn't change, another call will happen to another family. Asterisk, his refusal to gloat disarmed critics and elevated the conversation. He turned the focus away from individuals and toward institutions. For the wedding guests, the memory carried a dual weight, the sting of humiliation and the pride of resilience. They had watched their celebration threatened, but they had also seen dignity prevail. They spoke of Jimmy not just as a groom but as a leader, a man who had shielded his family with calm instead of anger. For the bride, the moment became part of their story. In speeches and toasts, the narrative of our wedding night included not just vows and dancing, but the trial they had endured together. Her smile in the photos carried more than joy, it carried defiance, resilience, and love sharpened by fire. And for Jimmy Brooks, the night marked a turning point. He had always believed in quiet leadership, in building systems instead of chasing headlines. But that night showed him that sometimes quiet leadership becomes loud simply because the world needs to hear it. His calmness had gone viral not because of wealth but because it revealed the truth. Dignity itself can be power. Months later, another wedding took place in the same neighborhood. This time, neighbors gathered to help set up chairs. Officers on community patrol walked by, waved, and wished the couple congratulations without suspicion. Guests danced under string lights without glancing nervously at the street. And when laughter rose above the hedges, no one dialed 911. The cul-de-sac had changed. The city had changed. Even the conversation around corporate responsibility had changed. And though progress was uneven, fragile, and still unfinished, the seeds had been planted in the soil of that wedding night. Jimmy often said little about the incident afterward. When asked in interviews, he only repeated the same phrase, asterisk, respect should not depend on titles. Asterisk. But for those who had been there, for the bride clutching her bouquet, for the guests holding their breath, for the neighbors filming on their phones, that night would always be more than a headline. It was the night quiet power met loud prejudice, and dignity rewrote the ending. The wedding had been interrupted, humiliated, nearly broken. But in its place rose something bigger: reform, reflection, and a reminder that justice often begins not in courtrooms, but in backyards, under lanterns, where ordinary people decide to record, to speak, to change.